Sometimes the greatest act of love comes from the most unexpected places. When Grace Montgomery found 3 frightened children abandoned in a grand mansion, she made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Grace was just a black maid in 1960s Alabama, working for a wealthy white family who had mysteriously disappeared. She had every reason to walk away, but her heart wouldn't let her leave those children behind. So she took them in and raised them as her own, teaching them right from wrong in a world that wasn't always fair. 19 years later, those children are all grown up. One became a successful lawyer, ready to take on the biggest case of her career. But this isn't just any case. It's about to tear apart the only family she's ever known. What happens when fighting for justice means betraying the woman who saved your life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors that Grace Montgomery had cleaned countless times before. But on this September day in 1965, everything felt different. The silence that had settled over the grand house for the past 3 days wasn't the comfortable quiet of a family away on vacation. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of abandonment. Grace stood in the doorway of the library, her calloused hands gripping the wooden frame as she watched 3 small figures huddled together on the Persian rug. Emma, barely 8 years old, had her arms wrapped protectively around 4-year-old Sarah, while 6-year-old Michael sat with his back straight, trying to be brave even though his lower lip trembled with barely contained tears. "Miss Grace," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "when are Mama and Papa coming back?" The question hit Grace like a physical blow. She'd been asking herself the same thing for 3 days now, ever since she'd arrived for work to find the children. Alone, the servants dismissed, and no sign of Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore anywhere. The police had been notified, but in 1965 Alabama, a black maid's concerns about a wealthy white family carried little weight, especially when there were no signs of foul play. Grace walked slowly into the library, her worn shoes silent on the thick carpet. Above the fireplace hung the family portrait that had always made her pause during her cleaning. Mr. Charles Whitmore in his finest suit, his hand resting on his wife Margaret's shoulder, and the 3 children posed formally in front of them. But now, looking at that painting, Grace noticed something she'd never seen before. The tension in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes, the way her smile seemed forced, the protective way she held little Sarah close to her chest. "I don't know, baby," Grace said softly, kneeling down beside the children. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Grace Montgomery had come to work for the Whitmores 2 years earlier, after her husband Samuel died in a construction accident, leaving her with nothing but his funeral expenses and a faith that had been tested but never broken. The job paid better than anything else available to a black woman in Montgomery, Alabama, and it allowed her to send money back to her elderly mother in Mississippi. She'd grown fond of the children during her time here, especially little Emma, who reminded Grace of herself at that age, curious, determined, and wise beyond her years. Mrs. Whitmore had been kind to Grace, kinder than most white women in their social circle, often asking about Grace's family, and sometimes even letting her eat at the kitchen table instead of standing while she took her meals. But Mr. Whitmore was a different story. Grace had learned to make herself invisible when he was around, sensing the tension that followed him through the house like a storm cloud. She'd overheard enough phone conversations to know his business dealings weren't always above board, and she'd seen the fear in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes when certain visitors came to call. Now, as she looked at these 3 abandoned children, Grace felt a pull in her chest that went beyond duty or employment. These weren't just the children of her employers. They were 3 souls in need of love and protection, and God help her, she couldn't walk away. "Miss Grace," Michael said, his small voice trying to sound grown up. I heard Papa talking on the phone before they left. He said something about having to disappear for a while. What does that mean? Grace's heart clenched. She'd suspected something like this might be the case. Mr. Whitmore's late-night phone calls, the strange visitors, Mrs. Whitmore's increasing anxiety, it all pointed to trouble that ran deeper than a simple family emergency. Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices, honey, Grace said carefully. But what matters now is that you three are safe, and we're going to figure this out together. Over the next several hours, Grace made a series of decisions that would alter the course of 4 lives forever. She called her pastor, Reverend Williams, who came immediately and helped her contact the proper authorities. She reached out to her sister Clara, who worked for a lawyer downtown, to understand what rights she might have in caring for the children. The news wasn't encouraging. As a black domestic worker with no legal standing, Grace had no authority to make decisions for 3 white children, regardless of their circumstances. The state would likely place them in foster care or an orphanage, separating them from each other and from the only stable presence left in their lives. But Grace had her worn leather Bible, passed down from her grandmother, and in its margins were written the notes and prayers of 3 generations of strong women who had faced impossible situations with unwavering faith. That night, as the children slept fitfully in their own beds, Grace, having decided they should stay in familiar surroundings for as long as possible, she sat at the kitchen table with her Bible open before her. The pages fell open to Matthew 25:40, and the King will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." Grace's grandmother had underlined that verse in fading ink years before, and now Grace understood why it had been preserved for her to find. These children weren't just the Whitmore heirs. They were God's children, placed in her path for a reason she was only beginning to understand. The next morning brought new challenges. Neighbors began to ask questions. Mrs. Patterson from Next. Eudore, a thin-lipped woman who'd never approved of Mrs. Whitmore's kindness to Grace, appeared at the kitchen door with a suspicious expression. "Grace, what are you still doing here? Where are the Whitmores?" "They had to leave suddenly on family business," Grace replied, the lie coming easier than she'd expected. "I'm staying to look after the children until they return." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "For how long? This isn't proper, you know. These children need proper supervision." "They have it," Grace said firmly, meeting the woman's gaze without flinching. "They have me." The conversation set a pattern that would repeat itself over the coming weeks. Phone calls were made. Questions were asked, but the Whitmores' wealth and social standing worked in Grace's favor. People assumed that arrangements had been made, that Grace's presence was authorized, that the family would return soon to reclaim their lives. Grace used that assumption to buy time to establish routines, to help the children process their abandonment, and to create a sense of stability in the chaos. She moved into the small servants' quarters off the kitchen, officially to be available at all times, but really because leaving the children alone, even for a few hours, felt like a betrayal of the trust they'd placed in her. Emma proved to be the most adaptable, throwing herself into her schoolwork with fierce determination. Michael struggled with anger and confusion, sometimes lashing out at Grace before dissolving into tears and apologies. Little Sarah simply clung to Grace's skirts, following her from room to room as if afraid she too might disappear. "Why did they leave us, Miss Grace?" Sarah asked one evening as Grace helped her with her bath. Grace paused, her hands gentle as she worked shampoo through the little girl's hair. "How do you explain abandonment to a 4-year-old? How do you make sense of parents who choose their own safety over their children's need for love and security?" "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense to us," Grace said finally. "But what I know for certain is that you are loved, all 3 of you. You are wanted and cherished and precious. By you, by me, always by me." It was a promise that would shape the next 2 decades of their lives, though Grace didn't know it yet. All she knew was that these 3 children needed her, and she would not let them down. As autumn turned to winter, Grace established new rhythms in the house. She learned to braid Emma's hair the way Mrs. Whitmore had done, to help Michael with his reading, to sing the lullabies that soothed Sarah's nightmares. She discovered that Emma had inherited her mother's love of books and her father's head for numbers. Michael had a mechanical mind that could take apart and reassemble anything he could get his hands on. Sarah was the artist, always drawing pictures of families. But now her families included Grace, a tall figure in an apron, standing protectively behind 3 small children. The money situation remained precarious. Grace had access to the household, accounts for basic expenses, but she knew that wouldn't last forever. She began taking in washing and mending from other families in the neighborhood, working late into the night to earn extra income while the children slept. Pastor Williams became their unofficial guardian in the community, vouching for Grace's character when questions arose and helping to navigate the complex social dynamics of a black woman raising white children in 1960s Alabama. The arrangement was unusual enough to raise eyebrows, but not so scandalous as to provoke immediate intervention, especially with the pastor's endorsement. But Grace knew that their situation was precarious. Every day brought the possibility that someone would challenge her authority, that the state would intervene, that the fragile family she was building would be torn apart. She began to prepare for that possibility, keeping careful records of the children's health and education, maintaining detailed accounts of household expenses, and most importantly, documenting every moment of love and care she provided. In her worn leather Bible, Grace began writing her own notes in the margins, prayers for wisdom, thanks for small blessings, and promises to God about the kind of mother she wanted to be to these children who had become her own in every way. That mattered. The portrait above the library fireplace remained unchanged, but the house itself began to reflect its new reality. Children's laughter echoed through rooms that had been quiet for too long. Finger paintings appeared on the refrigerator. Grace's simple, nourishing meals replaced the formal dinner parties that had once filled the dining room. And slowly, carefully, Grace Montgomery began to build something that had never existed in the Whitmore house before. A real family, bound not by blood or law, but by choice, love, and an unshakable commitment to stand by each other no matter what the world might bring. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, nearly 60 years after Grace Montgomery had first found 3 children huddled in a library and decided to change the course of her life. Sarah Whitmore. She'd kept the name, though she'd earned the right to it through love rather than birth. Stood in her corner office in downtown Atlanta, looking out at the bustling city below as her secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. Ms. Whitmore, there's a gentleman on line 3 who says it's about your mother. He says it's urgent. Sarah's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. At 34, she'd built a reputation as one of Georgia's most formidable civil rights attorneys. But the word urgent in connection with Grace still had the power to make her feel like a frightened 4-year-old again. "Put him through," she said, straightening her shoulders in a gesture she'd learned from Grace herself. Spine straight, chin up, ready to face whatever comes. "Ms. Whitmore, this is Thomas Henley from Henley, Morrison and Associates in Montgomery. I'm calling regarding Mrs. Grace Montgomery and some legal matters concerning the Whitmore estate." Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd been Sarah Whitmore for 30 years. Ever since Grace had legally adopted all 3 of them when the statute of limitations had run out on any potential return of their biological parents. The adoption had been Grace's gift to them on Sarah's 16th birthday, the security of knowing they truly belonged to someone who would never leave them. "What kind of legal matters?" Sarah asked, her attorney instincts kicking in even as her heart raced. "I'm representing the family of Charles Whitmore's cousin, Robert Whitmore, who recently passed away. They're contesting the original transfer of the Whitmore estate and questioning the legitimacy of Mrs. Montgomery's guardianship of the children. They're claiming she had no legal right to inherit or manage the estate, and they're seeking to recover what they consider stolen property. Sarah sank into her chair, the weight of the words hitting her like a physical blow. Grace was 84 years old now, her health fragile, but her spirit still strong. The thought of someone challenging the woman who'd sacrificed everything for them, questioning the legitimacy of the only family Sarah had ever really known, filled her with a rage she hadn't felt since childhood. "Mr. Henley," Sarah said, her voice taking on the steel edge that made opposing counsel nervous, "I'm going to stop you right there. Mrs. Montgomery is my adoptive mother, and those children you're referring to include me. I'm also an attorney, and I can tell you right now that any challenge to our family's legal standing is going to face significant opposition." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Whitmore, I understand this is personal for you, but my clients have legitimate questions about how a domestic worker came to control a multi-million-dollar estate. They're not questioning Mrs. Montgomery's character, but rather the legal technicalities, Sarah interrupted, of a woman who saved 3 children from abandonment, raised them as her own, and built a family out of nothing but love and determination. Mr. Henley, I suggest you and your clients think very carefully about pursuing this line of action." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her office for several long minutes, staring at the manila envelope that had arrived by courier while she was on the phone. Inside were copies of the legal documents being challenged, papers she hadn't seen in years, papers that represented the foundation of everything her family had built. The original guardianship papers from 1965 were there, yellowed with age, bearing the signatures of officials who had been impressed by Grace's determination to keep the children together. The adoption papers from 1985, when Sarah turned 16 and Grace made their relationship legally official. The will that Charles Whitmore had left, which had indeed transferred ownership of the house and a significant trust fund to the care of Grace Montgomery for the benefit of the children. But as Sarah read through the documents with fresh eyes, she began to see the vulnerabilities that opposing counsel had identified. The original guardianship had been granted under emergency circumstances, with minimal investigation into Grace's background or legal standing. The estate transfer, while legally valid, could be challenged on the grounds that Charles Whitmore had been under duress when he signed it, fleeing from unnamed troubles that had forced him to abandon his children. Sarah reached for her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Hello, Grace, it's Sarah. We need to talk." Even at 84, Grace's voice remained strong, though Sarah could hear the years in its slight tremor. "What's wrong, baby? You sound upset." "I'm coming home," Sarah said. "We have a legal situation, and I need to see those old papers you keep in the cedar chest, all of them." The drive from Atlanta to Montgomery took 4 hours. 4 hours for Sarah to remember and prepare for a battle she'd never expected to fight. She thought about Emma, now a respected middle school principal in Birmingham, who'd built her life around the education and nurturing values Grace had instilled. She thought about Michael, the decorated Army veteran who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to work with other veterans struggling with trauma and adjustment. All 3 of them had built successful lives, but those lives were grounded in the foundation Grace had provided. If someone succeeded in proving that Grace had no right to that foundation, what would it mean for everything they'd become? The Whitmore house looked smaller than Sarah remembered, though Grace had maintained it beautifully over the years. The garden was still immaculate, the windows still sparkled, and the family portrait still hung above the library fireplace, though now it was joined by dozens of other pictures chronicling the real life of the family that had grown up in these rooms. Grace met Sarah at the door, moving more slowly than she once had, but still carrying herself with the dignity that had always defined her. At 84, Her hair was completely grey, pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for decades, and her brown eyes still held the warmth and wisdom that had guided three lost children through their most difficult years. "Tell me what's happening," Grace said as they settled in the kitchen, the heart of the house where all important conversations had always taken place. Sarah explained the phone call, the legal challenge, the questions being raised about Grace's original authority. To care for them. As she spoke, she watched Grace's expression carefully, looking for signs of the fear or worry such news might provoke. Instead, she saw something that surprised her, a kind of resigned sadness, as if Grace had been expecting this day for years. "Mama," Sarah said, using the title that had come naturally once Grace adopted them. "They can't take this away from us. We won't let them." Grace reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in her own, hands that had bathed and fed and comforted three children through countless nights, hands that had worked tirelessly to provide for a family she'd chosen rather than birthed. "Sarah, baby, there are some things you don't know about those early days. Things I never told you, children, because I didn't want to burden you with adult troubles. But if we're going to fight this, you need to know the whole truth." "What kind of things?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. "Your father, Charles Whitmore, he wasn't just running from business troubles when he left. There were people looking for him, dangerous people, and he knew that staying would put you children at risk. The night before he and your mother left, he came to see me." Sarah felt her breath catch. "He came to see you. He gave me those papers, the ones that transferred guardianship and control of the estate. But he also gave me something else, something I've never told anyone about, not even Pastor Williams." Grace rose slowly and walked to a drawer Sarah had seen her open countless times over the years. From it, she withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "He gave me a letter," Grace said, "explaining everything. Where he was going, why he couldn't take you children, and what he wanted me to do. He also gave me the authority to make decisions about your care, including the decision to eventually adopt you legally if he and your mother never returned." Sarah stared at the envelope, understanding immediately that its contents could change everything about their legal position. "Grace, why didn't you ever—" "Because I wanted you children to build your lives on love, not on legal documents. I wanted you to know that you belonged with me because we chose each other, not because some piece of paper said so. But now, we might need that paper to prove we belong together at all." Grace nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm not afraid of their challenges, Sarah. I know in my heart that what we built here was right and good and blessed by God. But I am afraid of what this fight might cost you children. You've all built such beautiful lives, and I don't want my choices from 60 years ago to cast shadows over your futures." Sarah stood and wrapped her arms around the woman who had saved her life in every way that mattered, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and fresh-baked bread that had always meant safety and home. "Mama," she said firmly, "we're going to fight this, not because we have to, but because we want to, because you deserve to have your choices honored, and your love protected, and your family standing beside you when anyone questions the miracle you created in this house." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Sarah began to understand that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for the very definition of family, for the right of love to triumph over law, and for the recognition that sometimes the greatest parents are the ones who choose their children rather than simply giving birth to them. The manila envelope sat on the kitchen table between them, containing documents that would either save them or destroy them. But Sarah looked at Grace's face, still beautiful in its weathered strength, and knew that whatever those papers revealed, they would face it together, the way they had faced everything else for nearly 30 years. The real battle was just beginning. The next morning brought a stream of phone calls that reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with the law in the first place. The intricate dance of strategy, evidence, and human emotion that could determine the fate of everything that mattered. But first, she needed to call her siblings. Emma answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the calm authority that made her so effective with both students and parents at Jefferson Middle School. "Sarah, I was just thinking about you. How's Grace? That's actually why I'm calling. We need to talk, all of us. Can you drive down this evening and call Michael? We need him here too. What's wrong?" The shift in Emma's tone was immediate. The protective instincts that had made her the unofficial leader of their little group, even as children still strong at 38. "Someone's challenging Grace's legal right to have raised us. They want to claim the estate, and they're questioning everything, the guardianship, the adoption, all of it." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was steel, wrapped in silk. "I'll be there by 6, and Sarah, call that lawyer friend of yours in Birmingham, the one who specializes in family law. We're going to need all the help we can get." Michael was harder to reach, as he always was. The decorated veteran who'd served his country with distinction still struggled with the hypervigilance that had kept him alive overseas, but made peaceful domestic life a challenge. When Sarah finally connected with him at the Veterans Center where he worked, his response was immediate and military direct. "Who's threatening Grace?" "A law firm representing some distant Whitmore relatives. They're claiming she had no right to—" "I don't care what they're claiming. Nobody threatens our mother. I'll be there tonight. Michael, this needs to be handled legally, not— I know how to handle threats, Sarah, legal or otherwise." By evening, the kitchen that had hosted so many family discussions over the years was full again. Emma had brought her famous pecan pie, Grace's recipe, perfected over years of Sunday dinners, and Michael had stopped to pick up Grace's favorite flowers from the shop that had been delivering to the house for 3 decades. These small gestures of care spoke volumes about the bonds that had held them together through military deployments, career changes, marriages, and all the challenges of adult life. Grace had prepared dinner as she always did when her children came home, though Sarah noticed her hands shook slightly as she served the pot roast that had been their comfort food for as long as any of them could remember. The Purple Heart that Michael had earned in Afghanistan sat in its place of honor on the kitchen windowsill, a reminder of the values Grace had instilled in all of them: service, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right. "Tell them what you told me," Sarah said after they'd finished eating, after the familiar rhythm of shared meal and family conversation had settled their nerves enough for difficult truths. Grace repeated the story of Charles Whitmore's final visit, of the sealed letter that had been hidden for nearly 60 years, of the authority he'd given her to make decisions about their futures. As she spoke, Sarah watched her siblings' faces, seeing her own mix of surprise and understanding reflected there. "So he didn't just abandon us," Emma said quietly. "He made sure we'd be taken care of. He made sure you'd be loved," Grace corrected. "Taking care of you. That was something I chose to do because you became my heart." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. During his military service, he'd learned to analyze situations strategically, to identify threats, and develop responses. "What do we know about these people who are challenging us? Who are they, and what do they really want?" Sarah pulled out the file she'd been building since yesterday's phone call. Robert Whitmore was Charles's cousin, but they weren't close. "From what I can tell, Robert died 6 months ago, and his children are claiming that the original estate should have gone to him as the next male heir, rather than being left in trust for us." "That's archaic thinking," Emma said, her educator's instincts bristling at the unfairness. "It's also potentially profitable," Sarah replied. "The house alone is worth over $2 million now, and the trust fund has been growing for 60 years. We're talking about serious money." Michael stood and began pacing, a habit he'd developed during his most difficult readjustment period after returning from combat. "So this isn't about family or rightful inheritance. This is about greed, partly. But there's something else." Sarah hesitated, knowing that what she was about to say would hurt them all. "They're also questioning Grace's fitness as a guardian, both then and now. They're suggesting that a black domestic worker couldn't have provided appropriate care for 3 white children, that we were somehow damaged or deprived by being raised outside our proper social and racial environment. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. Emma's face flushed with anger, while Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Grace, however, looked unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting this particular attack for 60 years. "Let them come," Grace said quietly. "Let them look at what my children have become, and try to argue that you were damaged. Emma, you've influenced hundreds of young minds and helped them believe in themselves. Michael, you've served your country with honor, and now dedicate your life to helping other veterans heal. Sarah, you've built a career fighting for justice and equality. If that's what damage looks like, then I'm proud to have caused it." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes at the quiet pride in Grace's voice, the same pride that had carried them through skinned knees and teenage heartbreaks and adult challenges. But she also felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the knowledge that she would need to defend not just their legal rights, but their family's entire story. "I've been doing research," she said, pulling out another folder. "The good news is that the original guardianship documents are legally sound. Judge Morrison, who signed them, was known for being thorough, and there's no evidence that proper procedures weren't followed." "What's the bad news?" Michael asked. "The bad news is that social attitudes in 1965 weren't exactly progressive on issues of race and family structure. We'll need to prove not just that Grace had legal authority, but that she exercised it appropriately and that we benefited from her care rather than being harmed by it." Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Harmed by being raised by the most loving, principled, hard-working woman in Alabama? Harmed by growing up in a house where education was valued, where we were taught to treat everyone with respect, where we learned that family isn't about blood but about commitment?" "I know it sounds ridiculous to us," Sarah said, "but we have to remember that we'll be making these arguments in a legal system that's still influenced by outdated ideas about race, class, and family structure. We need to be prepared for anything." Grace reached across the table and took each of their hands in turn, her touch as comforting now as it had been when they were children waking from nightmares. "Listen to me," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had guided them through their most difficult moments. "I have never regretted the choice I made that day I found you in the library. Not when neighbors whispered, not when money was tight, not when people questioned whether I was doing right by you. You 3 are my greatest accomplishment, my deepest joy, and my most precious gift. Whatever these people want to take from us, they cannot take that truth away." As the evening wore on, they began to develop their strategy. Sarah would handle the legal research and courtroom arguments. Emma would gather character witnesses and documentation of their educational and personal achievements. Michael would investigate the opposing side, using his military contacts and natural suspicion to uncover whatever motivations might be driving the challenge. But underlying all their practical planning was a deeper understanding. They weren't just fighting for money or property. They were fighting for the right to define their own family, to honor the choice Grace had made 60 years ago, and to prove that love truly could be stronger than law, prejudice, or greed. The battle ahead would test everything Grace had taught them about courage, integrity, and standing up for what's right. But as Sarah looked around the kitchen table at the faces of the people who mattered most to her in the world, she felt ready for whatever came next. They were Grace Montgomery's children, and they would not go down without a fight. Emma's teaching award sat on the mantelpiece in the living room, its brass surface reflecting the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows Grace had kept spotless for 60 years. The award represented not just Emma's professional achievements, but the embodiment of Grace's belief that education could transform lives and that every child deserved someone who believed in their potential. Sarah spent the morning in Grace's study, surrounded by legal documents that painted a picture of careful stewardship and deep love. Every school report card had been saved, every medical record meticulously filed, every achievement documented with the pride of a mother who celebrated her children's successes as her own. But as she dug deeper into the opposing counsel's arguments, Sarah began to understand the scope of the challenge they faced. The phone rang, interrupting her research. "Sarah, this is David Chen from Henley's firm. I'm calling to discuss a potential settlement that might benefit everyone involved." Sarah's attorney instincts immediately went on high alert. Settlement offers this early usually meant the opposition either had a weak case or was hoping to avoid the expense and publicity of a trial. "I'm listening." "My clients are prepared to offer Mrs. Montgomery a substantial sum, let's say $200,000, in exchange for her voluntary relinquishment of any claims to the Whitmore estate. She could retain residence in the house for the remainder of her life, but ownership would transfer to the rightful heirs." "Mr. Chen," Sarah said, her voice dangerously calm, "are you suggesting that my mother, the woman who raised 3 children abandoned by their biological parents, should accept payment to give up her legal rights to property that was legitimately transferred to her care? I'm suggesting that a prolonged legal battle could be expensive and emotionally difficult for an elderly woman. This offer provides financial security without the stress of litigation." Sarah closed her eyes and counted to 10. A technique Grace had taught her during her teenage years when her temper ran hot. "Let me make something clear, Mr. Chen. We're not interested in settlements, buyouts, or any arrangement that questions the legitimacy of my mother's legal guardianship. If your clients want a fight, they'll get one." After hanging up, Sarah found Grace in the kitchen, preparing lunch with the same methodical care she'd brought to every task for 6 decades. The simple act of watching her mother move around the kitchen, reaching for the seasonings she knew by heart, adjusting the heat on the stove with practiced expertise, filled Sarah with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "They offered us money to go away," Sarah said without preamble. Grace paused in her stirring, but her voice remained steady. "How much money?" $200,000. Grace resumed stirring, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well, I suppose that's something, though I imagine they think it's a generous offer for a woman like me. A woman like you. An old black woman who should be grateful for whatever crumbs fall from the table." Grace's tone was matter-of-fact, without bitterness. "I've been hearing that particular song for 84 years, Sarah. The tune never changes, just the singers." Emma arrived that afternoon with a manila folder thick with documentation. Her organizational skills, honed by years of managing school records and student files, had produced a comprehensive timeline of their childhood achievements, community involvement, and adult successes. "I talked to Mrs. Patterson this morning," Emma said, settling at the kitchen table. "You remember her, the neighbor who used to watch us through her curtains when we were kids?" Sarah grimaced. Mrs. Patterson had been one of their harshest critics. In the early years, openly questioning whether Grace was capable of raising 3 white children properly. What did she say? That's the interesting part. She's 87 now, living in that assisted living place on Oak Street, and her perspective has evolved. She told me that watching Grace raise us was one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. She said she'd been wrong to judge, and if anyone tries to say Grace wasn't a good mother, they'd have to go through her first. Grace looked up from her cooking, genuine surprise on her face. "Pauline Patterson said that?" She also said, "She's kept every newspaper clipping about our achievements over the years, my teaching awards, Michael's military commendations, Sarah's cases in the civil rights field. She has them in a scrapbook." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. Through the window, they could see Michael's pickup truck, and behind it, an unfamiliar sedan with 2 men in suits getting out. "Expecting company?" Emma asked, but Grace was already moving toward the front door with the purposeful stride that meant she was preparing for battle. The older of the 2 men, silver-haired and expensively dressed, extended his hand as Grace opened the door. Mrs. Montgomery, I'm Robert Whitmore, Jr., and this is my attorney, Mr. Davidson. We were hoping we could have a few minutes of your time. Sarah appeared at Grace's shoulder, her protective instincts fully engaged. I'm Sarah Whitmore, Mrs. Montgomery's daughter and attorney. Any conversation regarding legal matters should go through me. Robert Jr.'s eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Sarah's professional demeanor and obvious connection to Grace. You're one of the children, then, the ones my late father's cousin took in. The ones Grace raised, Sarah corrected firmly. What can we do for you, Mr. Whitmore? We'd like to see the house, Davidson said, pulling out a legal pad. As potential heirs, we have certain rights to inspect the property and assess its current condition. Michael chose that moment to round the corner from the kitchen, his military bearing evident in every step. The sight of two strange men interrogating Grace brought out the protective instincts that had served him well in Afghanistan and made him a fierce advocate for his fellow veterans. Is there a problem here? Michael asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture that communicated volumes about their relationship. Her ability to calm his protective fury, his willingness to be guided by her wisdom, even as an adult. These gentlemen think they have a right to inspect our home, Grace said calmly. I was just about to explain that they're mistaken. Actually, Davidson interjected, consulting his legal pad, Alabama law provides for reasonable inspection rights when property ownership is in dispute. We're not asking to search through personal belongings, just to document the current state of the house and any improvements that have been made over the years. Sarah felt her professional instincts warring with her personal outrage. Legally, they probably did have some right to inspect the property, especially if they could demonstrate a legitimate claim to ownership. But the thought of these strangers walking through the house where Grace had raised them, judging the choices she'd made and the life she'd built, made Sarah's blood boil. Any inspection would need to be scheduled through proper legal channels, Sarah said carefully, and it would be conducted with our attorney present. Robert Jr. stepped forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and something that might have been respect. Mrs. Montgomery, I want you to know that this isn't personal. My family has questions about the legal transfer of property that occurred in 1965, but we're not here to attack your character or the job you did raising these children. Aren't you? Emma had emerged from the kitchen, her educator's eye taking in the dynamic between the visitors and her family, because questioning Grace's legal right to guardianship is exactly the same thing as questioning her fitness as a parent. Emma, Grace said quietly. But Emma continued, Do you have children? Mr. Whitmore, I do, 2 daughters. And if something happened to you and your wife tomorrow, if you had to leave them for their own safety, would you want them placed with someone who would love them unconditionally, or someone who shared their DNA but might not care about their happiness? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Robert Jr. looked uncomfortable, while Davidson made notes that suggested he was already anticipating this line of argument in court. Mrs. Montgomery, Robert Jr. said finally, I can see that you've raised remarkable children. That was never in question. But the legal issues surrounding the estate transfer are complex, and they need to be resolved properly. They were resolved properly, Michael said, his voice hard. 60 years ago, by people who understood that children need families, not just financial trusts. After the visitors left, the family gathered in the living room, the space where they'd shared Christmas, mornings and birthday celebrations, and all the ordinary moments that had built their extraordinary bond. Emma's teaching award caught the light, reminding them of the values Grace had instilled, the belief that every person had worth, that education could open doors, that love was more powerful than prejudice. They're going to keep pushing, Sarah said. The inspection, the settlement offer, they're testing us, seeing how far we'll go to defend our position. How far will we go? Emma asked. Grace looked around at her children, these 3 souls who had become her greatest pride and deepest joy. The purple heart on the windowsill caught the afternoon light, a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that ran in their family like a river. "As far as it takes," Grace said simply. "This family was built on love and sustained by faith. If they want to challenge that, let them try. But they should understand. We didn't survive 60 years of whispers and doubts and financial struggles just to give up now." Sarah felt a surge of determination that reached all the way back to the frightened 4-year-old who had clung to Grace's skirts and found safety there. They would fight this battle not just with legal briefs and court testimony, but with the evidence of their lives. 3 successful adults who had been shaped by a woman whose love knew no boundaries of race or class or social convention. The real battle was coming, and they would face it together, the way Grace had taught them to face everything, with courage, integrity, and the unshakable knowledge that they belonged to each other in ways that no court could ever truly understand or undo. The handwritten letter, yellowed with age and carefully folded, had been hidden in Grace's cedar chest for nearly 60 years. Sarah held it with trembling hands, recognizing the elegant script of Margaret Whitmore, the woman she had once called Mother, though Grace had earned that title through years of devoted love. "My dearest Grace," the letter began, dated just 3 days before the Whitmores disappeared forever. "By the time you read this, Charles and I will be gone, and I pray you will understand why we had to leave our precious children behind." Sarah looked up at Grace, who sat beside her in the bedroom where she'd slept every night since taking the children in, surrounded by the simple furnishings and family photographs that told the story of the life she'd built. "Grace, why didn't you ever show us this before?" "Because it wasn't time," Grace said simply. "Some truths are too heavy for children to carry. But now that you're fighting to protect our family, you need to understand everything." Sarah returned to the letter, her professional legal mind cataloguing its potential value as evidence, even as her heart broke for the frightened woman who had written it. "Charles has made terrible mistakes in his business dealings. People are threatening to hurt him, to hurt all of us. And the only way to keep the children safe is to disappear completely. We cannot take them with us. The life we'll have to live is no life for children, always running, always afraid. But you, Grace, you love them as I do. I see it in the way you braid Emma's hair when she's frustrated, how you patiently help Michael with his numbers, how you sing to Sarah when she has nightmares. You are already more of a mother to them than I have been these past months, consumed as I've been with fear for their safety. Charles has signed papers giving you full guardianship and control of the household accounts. The house will be yours, to manage for the children's benefit, and there is money set aside for their education and futures. We are not abandoning them. We are entrusting them to someone who will love them better than we ever could. I know what people will say about a black woman raising white children in Alabama. I know the challenges you will face, but I also know your heart, Grace Montgomery, and I know that these children will be blessed to have you as their mother in all the ways that matter. If we can ever return safely, we will. But if we cannot, please tell them that leaving them with you was the greatest act of love we could give them. They deserve a mother who will always be there, not parents who might be taken from them by violence at any moment. Raise them well, dear Grace. Love them as your own, and know that somewhere their birth parents are grateful every day for the miracle of your heart. With all my love and trust, Margaret. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. As she finished reading, understanding finally why Grace had always spoken of the Whitmores with such compassion rather than anger. "She knew," Sarah whispered. "She knew you would be the mother we needed. She was a good woman caught in an impossible situation," Grace said. "Her husband's choices put them all in danger, but she made sure you children would be safe and loved." The same letter changed everything about their legal position, but it also deepened the emotional weight of the battle they were fighting. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about honoring Margaret Whitmore's final wish that her children be raised by someone who would love them unconditionally. Sarah spent the next morning at the Montgomery County Courthouse, researching property records and inheritance laws that might support their case. The courthouse was familiar territory. She'd argued cases here during her early career before moving to Atlanta and the larger civil rights cases that had built her reputation. But research revealed troubling information. Robert Whitmore Sr., the cousin now deceased, had indeed been making inquiries about the Whitmore estate for several years before his death. More concerning, he had hired a private investigator who had been digging into Grace's background, the circumstances of the children's guardianship, and the legitimacy of the property transfer. They'd been planning this for a while, Sarah reported to Emma and Michael that evening, spreading documents across Grace's kitchen table. This isn't a spontaneous grab for money. It's a calculated legal strategy. Michael studied the investigator's report, his military training evident in how he analyzed the intelligence. They questioned neighbors, looked into Grace's financial records, even contacted some of our old teachers. They're building a case that Grace was unqualified to raise us. Based on what evidence? Emma demanded, her educator's sense of fairness outraged. Based on the social attitudes of 1965, Sarah said grimly. They're going to argue that regardless of Grace's good intentions, we were deprived of our rightful cultural and educational heritage by being raised by a black domestic worker instead of being placed with white families of similar social standing. Grace looked up from the mending she'd been working on, a habit from the early days when money was tight and every piece of clothing had to last. Let them make that argument, she said quietly, and then let them explain how being placed in foster care or an institution would have been better for 3 traumatized children than being raised in a home filled with love. Emma stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden Grace had tended for 60 years. Vegetables and flowers growing together in careful harmony, just like the family she'd cultivated in the same soil. They don't understand what we had here, she said. They see a black woman and white children and think they know the whole story. What story do they think they know? Michael asked. The one where the help gets above her station, Emma replied, her voice tight with controlled anger, where proper social boundaries weren't maintained, where children were somehow damaged by being raised outside their appropriate race and class. Sarah felt her own anger rising, the same protective fury she'd felt as a child whenever anyone questioned Grace's authority or suggested the family wasn't real. Then we'll have to show them a different story. We'll have to prove that what Grace gave us was worth more than any proper social standing could have provided. The conversation was interrupted by the phone ringing. Grace answered with the gracious tone she'd maintained throughout 6 decades of unwanted calls from bill collectors, nosy neighbors, and now hostile lawyers. Mrs. Montgomery, this is Ellen Morrison from the Montgomery Advertiser. I understand. There's a legal challenge to your guardianship of the Whitmore children from the 1960s. I'd like to do a story about the case, if you'd be willing to talk. Sarah was at Grace's side immediately, her media training kicking in. Public attention could help their cause by building sympathy for Grace's situation. But it could also backfire if the coverage focused on the unusual racial dynamics of their family structure. Ms. Morrison, Sarah interjected, I'm Mrs. Montgomery's attorney and daughter. Any media inquiries should go through me. Of course. I'm particularly interested in the human interest angle. A woman who stepped up to care for abandoned children, the family she built, the success of those children as adults. It's an inspiring story. It's also a private family matter currently in litigation, Sarah replied carefully. After hanging up, they discussed the implications of media coverage. Public sympathy could put pressure on the opposing side to settle or withdraw their challenge, but it could also attract more attention from people who might have their own objections to the unusual family they'd created. I'm not ashamed of anything we built here, Grace said firmly. If people want to judge us, let them look at the evidence. 3 children who were lost and frightened became 3 adults who contribute to their communities and live lives of Integrity. If that's not success, I don't know what is. As the evening wore on, Sarah began to see the shape of the battle ahead more clearly. They would need to fight not just legal arguments, but social prejudices that ran deep in Southern culture. They would need to prove that love could triumph over law, that family bonds forged by choice were as strong as those created by birth, and that Grace Montgomery had been not just an adequate guardian, but an exceptional mother. The letter from Margaret Whitmore would be their secret weapon, proof that Grace's guardianship had been not just legal, but blessed by the children's birth mother. Combined with the evidence of their successful adult lives and the support of their community, it might be enough to win. But as Sarah looked at Grace, now showing every one of her 84 years, she knew that winning in court was only part of the victory they needed. They also had to win in the court of public opinion, proving once and for all that the family Grace had built through sacrifice and love was as real and valuable as any family created by blood and law. Michael's military contacts proved invaluable in ways Sarah hadn't expected. 3 days after he'd started making calls to former intelligence colleagues, he walked into Grace's kitchen with a file folder that would change everything they thought. They knew about Charles Whitmore's disappearance. "You need to see this," Michael said, spreading photographs and documents across the table where they'd shared so many family meals. Charles Whitmore wasn't just running from business troubles, he was running from the FBI. The hidden business records told a story of desperation and dangerous choices. Charles Whitmore had been laundering money for organized crime figures, using his legitimate real estate business as a front for illegal transactions. When the FBI investigation closed in, he'd been given a choice: cooperate and testify against his criminal associates, or disappear before they decided he knew too much to live. He chose to disappear, Sarah said, studying a photograph of Charles, meeting with men whose faces had been redacted from the FBI surveillance photos. But why not take the children with them? Michael pointed to a memo dated 2 weeks before the Whitmores vanished, because his criminal associates had threatened the children directly. The FBI couldn't guarantee their safety if Charles stayed and testified, and taking them on the run would have made them targets for the rest of their lives. Emma picked up a document detailing the threats that had been made against the Whitmore family. So leaving us with Grace wasn't abandonment. It was the only way to keep us alive. The revelation recontextualized everything about their childhood, but it also raised new concerns about the current legal challenge. If Robert Whitmore Jr. was simply a greedy relative seeking easy money, that was one thing. But if he was connected to the original criminal enterprise, their opposition might be more dangerous than they'd realized. "Michael," Sarah said carefully, "what do your contacts think about Robert Jr.? Is this just about inheritance, or is there something else going on?" Michael's expression grew serious, the same look he'd worn during his most dangerous missions. "Overseas, they're looking into it, but there's something else you need to know. The private investigator Robert Sr. hired? He specializes in cases involving organized crime and family assets. This isn't the kind of lawyer you hire for a simple inheritance dispute." Grace had been listening quietly, her hands folded in her lap in the same posture she'd maintained during countless difficult conversations over the years. Now she spoke with the calm authority that had guided 3 children through their most challenging moments. "So Charles was trying to protect us," she said, "and now, all these years later, someone else is threatening the family he died trying to save." The phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Emma answered, recognizing the number of Jefferson Middle School where she worked as principal. "Emma, I'm sorry to bother you at home," came the voice of her secretary, Mrs. Johnson, "but there's been a man here asking questions about you, about your background, your family, your childhood. He said he was doing a background check for some kind of legal matter." Emma's face paled. "What kind of questions?" "About whether you were really qualified for your position, whether your upbringing might have affected your ability to relate to students and parents. He seemed particularly interested in the racial dynamics of your family situation." After hanging up, Emma sank into her chair, the full implications of what they were facing becoming clear. They're not just challenging Grace's guardianship, they're trying to destroy our professional reputations. If they can make it seem like we were somehow damaged or unqualified because of how we were raised, they undermine everything we've achieved. Michael stood and began pacing, his military training evident in how he approached the new threat. They're attacking on multiple fronts, legal, professional, and personal. It's a coordinated campaign designed to pressure us into accepting their settlement offer. Sarah felt her protective instincts flaring, the same fierce loyalty that had made her choose civil rights law as her career. But she also felt something else, a growing understanding of just how high the stakes really were. "There's something I haven't told you," she said quietly. "Yesterday I got a call from the Georgia Bar Association. Someone filed a complaint about my fitness to practice law, questioning whether my unconventional upbringing might have affected my professional judgment." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock Grace had bought at a church sale 30 years ago, when money was tight, but the family was rich in love and laughter. "They're trying to destroy everything we've built," Emma said finally. "Our careers, our reputations, our family's legacy, all of it." Grace rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where she'd taught 3 children to plant seeds and 10 growing things with patience and love. When she turned back to them, her face was set with the same determination that had carried her through 60 years of challenges. "Let them try," she said simply. "Let them look at what we've built here and try to tear it down. But they should understand something. This family has survived poverty, prejudice, and every form of doubt and criticism that small minds can devise. We didn't build our lives on other people's approval, and we won't let other people's attacks destroy what God has blessed." The evening brought another development that changed their understanding of the opposition's strategy. Sarah's friend in Birmingham, the family law specialist Emma had suggested, called with disturbing news. "Sarah, I've been researching the Henley firm and there are some red flags. They specialize in asset recovery cases, often involving disputed inheritances where the original transfers might have been legally questionable. But they also have connections to firms that work for, let's say, clients who prefer to remain anonymous." "What kind of clients?" "The kind who might have old grudges and long memories about families who disappeared with knowledge of their business operations." The implications were chilling. If Charles Whitmore's criminal associates were somehow behind the current legal challenge, then Grace and her children weren't just fighting for their inheritance, they were fighting for their safety. "We need protection," Michael said after Sarah shared the lawyer's concerns. "If these people are connected to organized crime, this could escalate beyond legal challenges." Grace shook her head firmly. "We need truth and faith, and the support of our community. Those have carried us through every challenge we've faced, and they'll carry us through this one." Emma looked around the kitchen where they'd gathered for family meetings for 3 decades, where Grace had dispensed wisdom and comfort and unconditional love to 3 children who had needed all of those things desperately. "Then we fight," Emma said. "We fight with everything we have, and we trust that the truth will be enough." As night fell over Montgomery, Alabama, the family that Grace had built, through sacrifice and love, prepared for a battle that would test everything they believed about justice, family, and the power of truth to triumph over greed and prejudice. The documents spread across the kitchen table told a story of danger and protective love that spanned 60 years. Charles and Margaret Whitmore had given their children the greatest gift they could, placing them with someone who would love them unconditionally, even if it meant never being able to return to claim them. Now, as adults, those children would have to prove that the love they'd received was worth more than the conventional family structure they'd been denied, and that Grace Montgomery's heart had been the perfect place to build a life of meaning and purpose. The battle was far from over, but they would face it together, the way Grace had taught them to face everything else. Emma's recovered memories came back in fragments, triggered by the scent of Grace's lavender soap and the sound of rain against the windows of her childhood bedroom. She'd been staying at the house for 3 days now, ostensibly to help with legal preparations, but really because being away from Grace during this crisis felt like abandonment. It was the birth certificate that broke everything open. Emma had been searching through Grace's cedar chest for any additional documents that might support their case when she found the manila envelope tucked beneath layers of baby blankets and childhood mementos. Her hands trembled as she opened it, expecting to find more evidence of Grace's careful record-keeping over the years. Instead, she found her own birth certificate, not the one she'd always known, issued when she was 8 years old as part of the legal guardianship process, but an original certificate dated September 15, 1956, bearing the name Emma Grace Montgomery and listing Grace Montgomery as the mother. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Emma stared at the document. The father's name was left blank, but the mother's signature was unmistakably Grace's, younger, but the same careful script that had signed permission slips and birthday cards for 30 years. Emma sank onto Grace's bed, the certificate clutched in her shaking hands as memories flooded back, not the traumatic memories of abandonment she'd always carried, but earlier ones, softer ones, of being held by Grace in ways that spoke of deeper connection than employer to child. She remembered now the way Grace had always braided her hair with special tenderness, the lullabies that were different from the ones she sang to Michael and Sarah, the private moments when Grace would hold her close and whisper, "My precious girl," in a voice thick with emotion Emma had been too young to understand. The bedroom door opened quietly, and Grace appeared, moving with the careful steps of someone who'd been dreading this moment for 30 years. "You found it," Grace said simply, sitting beside Emma on the bed where she'd comforted countless nightmares and fears. "You're my mother," Emma whispered, the words feeling strange and familiar. At the same time, "My real mother." Grace reached for Emma's hands, her touch as gentle as it had been when Emma was 4 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. "You are my daughter, in every way that matters, baby girl. You always have been. But the Whitmores, I was 17 when you were born," Grace said quietly. "Unmarried, scared, working as a cleaning girl for families who looked down on me. I gave you to the Whitmores because I thought they could give you things I never could. Education, opportunities, a life without the limitations that came with being poor and black in 1950s Alabama." Emma felt tears streaming down her face as the pieces of her life rearranged themselves into a completely different pattern. "You gave me away. I gave you a chance," Grace corrected gently, "but I couldn't stay away from you. When the Whitmores offered me a job, I took it because it meant I could watch you grow up, even if I couldn't claim you as mine. And then they left." Grace nodded, her eyes bright with tears she'd held back for decades. "And God gave me a second chance to be your mother, along with the gift of Michael and Sarah. I tried to love all 3 of you equally, but you were the child of my heart from the moment you were born." Emma pulled back, searching Grace's face for answers to questions she wasn't sure how to ask. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years, why didn't you tell any of us?" "Because I wanted you to choose me," Grace said simply. "Not because biology said you had to, but because love said you wanted to. I needed to know that when you called me Mama, it was because I'd earned that title through my actions, not because some piece of paper said it was my right." The revelation changed everything about the legal case, but it also changed everything about Emma's understanding of her own identity. She thought of all the times she'd wondered why she felt so connected to Grace, why their bond seemed to run deeper than the relationships Grace had with Michael and Sarah, why Grace's approval meant more to her than anyone else's opinion. "Does this mean—" Emma started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the implications. "It means you're my biological daughter and my adopted daughter," Grace said. "It means the family we built was even more blessed than we knew. And it means that No court in Alabama can question my right to have raised you, because you were mine from the beginning." Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Grace had taught her to plant tomatoes and pull weeds and understand that growing things required patience and faith. The woman she'd called mother for 30 years had always been her mother, even during the years when she couldn't claim that relationship openly. "What about Michael and Sarah?" Emma asked. "Do they know?" "No. I wanted to tell all of you together when the time was right. But now, with this legal battle, now it changes our entire strategy," Emma said, her educator's mind already working through the implications. "If I'm your biological daughter, then at least part of their challenge falls apart completely." Grace smiled, the same proud smile she'd worn at Emma's high school graduation, her college ceremony, and every professional achievement since. "My smart girl. Yes, it changes things legally, but more importantly, it changes how we understand our family. We weren't just 3 children who needed a home, we were always meant to be together." Emma returned to the bed and took Grace's hands, studying the face she'd loved for as long as she could remember. In Grace's eyes, she could see echoes of her own features, similarities she'd never noticed because she'd never been looking for them. "I'm angry," Emma said honestly. "Not about being given away when you were young. I understand why you made that choice, but about the secrecy. All these years, I thought I was an orphan who got lucky. I never knew I had a mother who loved me. From the moment I was born." Grace nodded, accepting the criticism with the same grace she'd shown in accepting praise. "I made the best choices I could with the wisdom I had at the time, but you're right to be angry. You deserve to know the truth about where you came from." "What I came from," Emma said slowly, "was love. Complicated, sacrificial, imperfect love, but love nonetheless." They sat together in the quiet of late afternoon, mother and daughter processing the truth that had been hidden for 3 decades. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood continued. Children playing, dogs barking, the ordinary rhythms of life that had provided the soundtrack for their extraordinary family story. "We have to tell Michael and Sarah," Emma said finally. "And then we have to decide how to use this information in court." Grace stood, straightening her shoulders with the dignity that had carried her through 6 decades of challenges. "We'll tell them tonight at dinner, the way we've shared every important family news for 30 years. And then we'll face whatever comes next together, all of us, as a family." As evening approached, Emma helped Grace prepare the meal that would accompany the most significant revelation in their family's history. She moved through the familiar rhythms of setting the table and stirring the pot roast, but everything felt different now that she understood her true relationship to the woman who had shaped her life. The birth certificate sat on Grace's dresser, a piece of paper that would reshape their legal strategy and their understanding of what family meant. Emma Grace Montgomery Whitmore. She'd been carrying pieces of her identity her whole life without knowing it. When Michael and Sarah arrived for dinner, they found Emma and Grace working together in the kitchen with a closeness that seemed even more pronounced than usual. Neither suspected that they were about to learn that their family had been even more miraculous than they'd realized, that love had guided not just Grace's choice to keep them together, but her decision to give Emma life in the first place. The battle ahead would be fought with new weapons now. Not just the legal authority Grace had been granted, but the biological bond that no court could question. But more than that, it would be fought with the understanding that their family had been blessed from the very beginning, woven together by threads of sacrifice and love that stretched back to Emma's birth and forward to whatever future they would build together. The greatest plot twist in their lives wasn't what had happened to them. It was what had always been true, waiting patiently to be discovered. Grace's journal, discovered beneath loose floorboards in the pantry where she'd hidden it for 60 years, contained the full story of her sacrifice and the agonizing decision that had shaped 4 lives. Sarah read the entries aloud to Michael, and Emma as they sat around the kitchen table, the same table where they'd learned Emma was Grace's biological daughter just hours before. March 15th, 1956, Sarah read, her voice thick with emotion. My baby girl is 2 weeks old today, and I have to give her away tomorrow. Mrs. Whitmore came to see me at the hospital, so kind and gentle, promising that Emma will have everything I cannot give her. I tell myself this is love, but my heart is breaking into pieces I don't think will ever heal. The journal chronicled years of watching Emma grow up from a distance, of finding excuses to visit the Whitmore house, of taking the job as their maid so she could be near the daughter she'd given up but never stopped loving. June 12, 1963, Sarah continued. Emma lost her first tooth today. I helped Mrs. Whitmore put it under her pillow for the tooth fairy, and my heart sang because I was there for this moment, even if she doesn't know I'm her mama. Maybe this is enough. Maybe being able to love her from close by is more than I deserve. Michael wiped tears from his eyes, his military composure cracking as he understood the depth of Grace's sacrifice. You watched your own daughter call another woman mama for 8 years. And then we became your responsibility too, Emma said, her voice filled with wonder and guilt. When the Whitmores left, you didn't just take in 3 children, you got the chance to finally claim your own daughter, plus 2 others who needed you just as much. Grace had been quiet through their reading of the journal, her hands folded in her lap, allowing her children to process the magnitude of what she'd endured and chosen out of love. Now, she spoke with the quiet authority that had guided them through every crisis of their lives. God has a way of making things right, she said simply. I gave Emma away because I thought she deserved better than what I could provide. But then life gave me the chance to prove that love is better than money, that a mother's heart is more valuable than social standing, and that the family we choose can be stronger than the one we're born into. The legal implications of the journal were staggering. Not only did it document Grace's biological relationship to Emma, but it also revealed the depth of planning that had gone into the guardianship arrangement. Charles Whitmore hadn't just handed over his children to the nearest available caregiver. He'd carefully chosen the woman who had already proven her devotion by sacrificing her own happiness for Emma's welfare. This changes everything, Sarah, he said, her attorney mind racing through the possibilities. Emma being your biological daughter destroys half their argument right there. And the journal proves that your guardianship wasn't opportunistic. It was the culmination of years of demonstrated maternal love. But even as they developed their new legal strategy, the opposition escalated their attacks. The next morning brought devastating news. The Georgia Bar Association had scheduled a formal hearing on Sarah's fitness to practice law, while the Alabama Department of Education was reviewing Emma's credentials and considering suspending her principal's license, pending the outcome of the inheritance case. They're trying to destroy our livelihoods, Emma said, pacing the kitchen with barely contained fury. If they can't win legally, they'll ruin us professionally. Michael had spent the morning on the phone with his military contacts, and his expression was grim when he joined the family meeting. It's worse than we thought. The private investigator they hired has been spreading rumors about Grace's mental competency, suggesting that an elderly black woman might have fabricated evidence to support false claims. Grace looked up from the mending she'd been working on, a habit that calmed her during times of stress, and her voice was steel wrapped in silk. Let them question my mind. My memory is just fine, and I have 60 years of witnesses to the life I've built with my children. The afternoon brought an unexpected ally. Pastor Williams, now in his 70s, but still commanding respect throughout Montgomery's black community, arrived with a delegation of church members and community leaders who had watched Grace raise her children with admiration and love. Grace Montgomery, Pastor Williams said, settling into the kitchen chair he'd occupied during countless family celebrations over the years. This community has something to say about the kind of mother you've been. The delegation included Mrs. Patterson, the formerly critical neighbor who now served as Grace's most vocal supporter, Dr. James Henderson, the black physician who had treated all three children throughout their youth, and Professor Mary Johnson, from Alabama State University, who had taught Sunday school with Grace for 20 years. "We're prepared to testify," Dr. Henderson said, "about the quality of care these children received, the educational opportunities Grace provided, the way she handled every crisis with wisdom and grace. And we're prepared to challenge anyone who suggests that love knows anything about color," Professor Johnson added. "Grace Montgomery raised three children to be productive, educated, moral citizens. If that's not successful parenting, I don't know what is." But even as support rallied around them, Grace's health began to decline under the stress of the legal battle. Sarah noticed her mother moving more slowly, eating less, and spending long hours staring out the kitchen window with the distant look that suggested she was preparing for possibilities she didn't want to voice. "Mama," Sarah said during a quiet moment when the others had gone to bed, "are you all right?" Grace smiled, the same patient smile she'd worn through decades of children's questions and concerns. "I'm tired, baby. More tired than I've ever been. But I'm not ready to rest until this family is protected." The evening brought news that sent chills through the entire family. Michael's security contact called with a warning. The private investigator who had been digging into their background had connections to criminal organizations, and there were indications that someone with deep pockets and long-held grudges was funding the legal challenge. "We think Charles Whitmore's old associates are behind this," the contact explained. "They never forgot about the money he took when he disappeared, and they've been waiting 60 years for a chance to recover what they consider stolen assets." The revelation cast the legal battle in an entirely new light. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about revenge against a family who had benefited from a criminal's attempt to protect his children from the consequences of his choices. "So they're using Robert Whitmore Jr. as a front," Michael said, his military strategist mind working through the implications. "The inheritance claim gives them legal standing to challenge the estate transfer, but their real goal is to recover money they think Charles Whitmore owed them." Sarah felt fear creeping up her spine, not for herself, but for Grace and the family they'd built together. If they're connected to organized crime, this could become dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with courtrooms. Grace listened to their concerns with the calm acceptance she'd shown in facing every challenge over 60 years. When they finished outlining the threats they were facing, she rose and walked to the kitchen drawer, where she'd kept her worn leather Bible for as long as any of them could remember. Psalm 27, she said, opening to a page marked with ribbon and worn from decades of reading. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" She read the entire psalm aloud, her voice growing stronger with each verse, reminding her children of the faith that had carried her through 17 years of pregnancy and abandonment, 43 years of single motherhood, and now this final test of everything she'd built. "Tomorrow we go to court," Grace said when she finished reading. "We tell our story, we present our evidence, and we trust that truth and love are stronger than greed and hatred." "What if the judge doesn't see it that way?" Emma asked. "What if legal technicalities matter more than the life we've built?" Grace closed the Bible and looked around the kitchen where she'd nourished 3 children through every stage of their development, where she'd dispensed wisdom and comfort and unconditional love for 30 years. "Then we'll face whatever comes, with the same faith that brought us this far," she said. "But I have to believe that God didn't guide us through 60 years of challenges just to let us lose everything now." As the family prepared for the court battle that would determine their fate, Sarah felt the weight of representing not just their legal interests, but their entire story. The miracle of a teenage mother's sacrifice, the blessing of being chosen by children who needed love more than biological connection, and the triumph of a family built on faith, determination, and unshakable commitment to each other. The journal sat on the kitchen table, its pages chronicling 6 decades of love that had shaped 4 lives in ways that no court could fully measure or legal challenge could diminish. Tomorrow, they would find out whether justice could recognize the value of what Grace had given them, or whether the letter of the law would triumph over the spirit of love that had made their family possible. Grace's health concerns added urgency to their fight, but her unwavering faith provided the foundation they needed to face whatever verdict awaited them. They had truth on their side, love in their hearts, and each other to depend on, the same combination that had carried them through every previous challenge. The real test was about to begin, and they would face it together, the way Grace had taught them to face everything else, with courage, integrity, and absolute confidence that they belonged to each other in ways that transcended law, race, and social convention. The Montgomery County Courthouse had seen many battles over justice and family, but few as emotionally charged as the one that began on a humid Tuesday morning in April. Sarah stood at the plaintiff's table, wearing the navy suit that had become her armor in countless civil rights cases, while across the aisle, Thomas Henley and his team arranged documents that represented 60 years of careful planning to undermine everything Grace had built. Grace sat in the front row of the gallery, her worn leather Bible in her lap, the same Bible that had guided her through decades of difficult decisions. Despite her declining health, she had insisted on being present for every moment of the proceedings, though Sarah had arranged for video testimony from her hospital bed as a backup plan. Judge Patricia Morrison, granddaughter of the judge who had originally approved Grace's guardianship, called the court to order with the gravity befitting a case that would determine the fate of a family and the validity of choices made in love and desperation 60 years earlier. "Your Honor," Sarah began, rising to address the court with the confidence that had made her reputation in civil rights law, "this case is not really about property or inheritance law. It's about the definition of family, the nature of love, and the question of whether legal technicalities should triumph over a lifetime of devoted care." She gestured toward Grace, whose dignified presence commanded respect even from those who questioned her choices. Mrs. Grace Montgomery didn't seek guardianship of 3 children for financial gain. She accepted responsibility for them because their parents entrusted her with their most precious possessions, their children's lives, futures, and happiness. Sarah presented Margaret Whitmore's letter first, watching the judge's expression carefully as she read the birth mother's own words, explaining the choice to entrust her children to Grace's care. The letter's authenticity had been verified by handwriting experts, and its emotional impact was undeniable. The biological mother herself recognized that Mrs. Montgomery was not just a caregiver, but the person best suited to raise her children with the love and stability they deserved. Sarah continued. Henley's objection came swiftly. "Your Honor, this letter, while touching, doesn't address the legal irregularities surrounding the original guardianship. A domestic worker, regardless of her good intentions, lacked the social and financial resources necessary to properly raise 3 white children in 1960s Alabama." "Your Honor," Sarah responded, "the opposing counsel seems to suggest that love, dedication, and moral character are less important than social status or racial matching. I submit that the evidence will show the opposite, that Mrs. Montgomery provided superior care precisely because she chose these children out of love rather than legal obligation." The first witness was Dr. Henderson, the black physician who had treated all 3 children throughout their youth. His testimony painted a picture of careful medical care, prompt attention to health concerns, and a mother who prioritized her children's well-being above all else. "In 40 years of medical practice," Dr. Henderson said, his voice carrying the authority of experience, "I never saw more devoted parenting than what Grace Montgomery provided. She knew every detail of those children's health, kept meticulous records, and never missed an appointment or delayed necessary treatment. Henley's cross-examination attempted to suggest that a black doctor's care might have been inferior to what white physicians could have provided, earning him a sharp rebuke from Judge Morrison and murmurs of disapproval from the gallery. Emma took the stand next, her credentials as an educator lending weight to her testimony about the quality of her upbringing. But Henley's questioning quickly turned personal and ugly. "Ms. Whitmore, isn't it true that you've struggled with identity issues throughout your adult life, never quite fitting into either black or white social circles?" "Objection," Sarah called out, but Emma was already answering. "Mr. Henley, I've never struggled with my identity. I know exactly who I am. The daughter of a woman who taught me that character matters more than color, that education opens doors that prejudice tries to close, and that love is the most powerful force in human experience." The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly gavelled down by Judge Morrison, but not before Emma's words had clearly resonated with the packed gallery. "Furthermore," Emma continued, "I'd like to present evidence that has recently come to light regarding my relationship to Mrs. Montgomery." Sarah approached the bench with Emma's birth certificate, watching Henley's face pale as he realized the implication of what he was seeing. The revelation that Emma was Grace's biological daughter destroyed a significant portion of his argument about inappropriate racial guardianship. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "this birth certificate proves that Mrs. Montgomery was not just the guardian. Of these children, she was the biological mother of one of them, who had been placed with the Whitmores in a private adoption arranged when Mrs. Montgomery was 17 years old." The courtroom buzzed with surprise and emotional reaction as the full scope of Grace's sacrifice became clear. She hadn't just taken in 3 abandoned children. She had reclaimed her own daughter while accepting responsibility for 2 others who needed her just as much. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess, during which Sarah could see Henley huddling with his clients, their carefully constructed case beginning to crumble under the weight of evidence they hadn't anticipated. When court reconvened, Michael took the stand, his military bearing and decorated service record providing powerful testimony about the values Grace had instilled in her children. His account of growing up in Grace's care painted a picture of discipline tempered with love, high expectations balanced with unwavering support. But it was Grace herself who would provide the most compelling testimony, and as the afternoon wore on, Sarah prepared to present the case's most crucial witness, the woman whose choice to love had created the family they were fighting to protect. Grace took the witness stand with the same dignity she had brought to every challenge of her 84 years, her worn leather Bible clutched in her hands, not for show, but for the strength it had provided through 6 decades of faithful service. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in, every person present understanding they were witnessing something remarkable. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah began gently, "please tell the court about the day you found 3 children alone in the Whitmore mansion." Grace's voice was clear and strong as she recounted that September morning in 1965, when she had discovered 3 frightened children and made the choice that would define the rest of her life. Her testimony was simple, direct, and filled with the quiet authority of someone who had never questioned whether love could overcome any obstacle. "I looked at those babies," Grace said, her eyes finding Emma, Michael, and Sarah in the gallery, "and I saw children who needed someone to love them unconditionally, not someone to provide for them financially or give them social advantages, but someone to hold them when they cried, to celebrate their victories, and to teach them right from wrong." "And you made the decision to take responsibility for all 3 children?" "I made the decision to become their mother in every way that mattered." Emma was already the child of my heart, though she didn't know it then. Michael and Sarah became my children through choice, and that choice was as binding as any biological connection could ever be. Henley's cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to paint Grace as an opportunistic domestic worker who had taken advantage of a family crisis for personal gain. but Grace met each attack with calm responses that revealed the depth of her sacrifice and the purity of her motives. Mrs. Montgomery, isn't it true that by assuming guardianship of these children, you gained access to a lifestyle and financial resources far beyond what you could have achieved on your own? Mr. Henley, Grace replied, her voice steady, I gained 3 children who needed love. Everything else, the house, the money, the responsibilities, those were burdens I accepted gladly because they came with the privilege of being called Mama. But you must admit that raising 3 white children as a black woman in 1960s Alabama was unusual, even controversial. Grace's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but her voice remained controlled. What was controversial was that 3 children had been abandoned by parents who chose their own safety over their children's welfare. What I did, love them, protect them, raise them to be good people, that wasn't controversial. That was what any decent person would do. The courtroom was completely silent as Grace continued. You want to talk about unusual? It was unusual that a 17-year-old girl had to give up her baby because she was poor and unmarried. It was unusual that good people like Charles and Margaret Whitmore had to choose between their children's safety and staying with them. It was unusual that 3 children had to grow up not knowing if their parents would ever come back. She paused, looking directly at Judge Morrison. But love isn't unusual. Love is what makes families, not blood or law or social convention. Love is what turns a house into a home, what turns strangers into family, what turns children who have every reason to give up hope into adults who contribute to their communities and live lives of honor. Henley attempted to undermine Grace's testimony by questioning her memory and mental acuity, but Grace's responses were sharp and detailed, revealing a mind that remained clear and focused despite her physical frailty. Mrs. Montgomery, you're asking this court to believe that your recollections from 60 years ago are accurate. I'm asking this court to look at the evidence of 3 successful adults who were raised with love, discipline, and moral guidance. I'm asking you to consider whether the children I raised turned out better or worse than they might have in foster care or institutions. Sarah's closing argument synthesized all the evidence into a powerful narrative about the triumph of love over law, choice over circumstance, and character over social convention. Your Honor, Sarah said, facing Judge Morrison with the confidence born of absolute conviction. The question before this court is simple. Should the choices made by loving parents 60 years ago be honored, or should greed and prejudice be allowed to destroy a family built on sacrifice and devotion? She gestured toward Grace, still sitting in the witness box with quiet dignity. Mrs. Montgomery didn't just raise 3 children, she saved them. She gave them stability when their world fell apart, love when they felt abandoned, and hope when they had every reason to despair. The opposing counsel asks you to invalidate that choice based on legal technicalities and social prejudices that should have died decades ago. But the evidence shows that Mrs. Montgomery provided superior care, that her children thrived under her guidance, and that the family she created has been a blessing to their community and their world. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess before rendering her verdict, during which the packed courtroom buzzed with emotional energy. Grace remained in her seat, surrounded by the community members who had supported her family through decades of challenges and triumphs. As they waited for the judge's decision, Sarah looked around the courtroom at the faces of people who had witnessed Grace's journey from teenage mother to family matriarch, and she felt confident that justice would recognize what everyone else could see clearly, that Grace Montgomery had been exactly the mother her children needed, chosen by God and circumstances to create something beautiful from the ashes of abandonment and loss. The gavel would fall soon, and with it would come the final verdict on whether love truly could triumph over law, prejudice, and greed. Judge Morrison returned to the bench with the measured pace of someone who understood that her words would echo through the lives of everyone in the courtroom. The gavel in her hands represented not just legal authority, but the power to validate or destroy 60 years of love, sacrifice, and family bonds built on choice rather than blood. In the matter of Whitmore versus Montgomery, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of careful deliberation. This court has been asked to determine the validity of guardianship arrangements made in 1965 and their continuing legal effect on the disposition of the Whitmore estate. Grace sat in the front row, her worn leather Bible closed in her lap, surrounded by the three adults who had once been frightened children clinging to her strength. Her face was calm, almost serene, as if she had already made peace with whatever decision the court might render. The evidence presented has been compelling and at times deeply moving. We have heard testimony about the circumstances that led to 3 children being placed in Mrs. Montgomery's care, the quality of that care over decades, and the remarkable achievements of those children as adults. Judge Morrison paused, her eyes finding Grace in the gallery. We have also learned that one of those children, Emma Whitmore, is in fact Mrs. Montgomery's biological daughter, placed with the Whitmore family in a private adoption arrangement when Mrs. Montgomery was 17 years old. This revelation fundamentally alters the legal landscape of this case. Mrs. Montgomery was not simply a domestic worker who assumed inappropriate authority over children outside her racial and social circle. She was a birth mother who, through extraordinary circumstances, was given the opportunity to reclaim her own child while accepting responsibility for 2 others in desperate need of care. The judge's voice grew stronger as she continued. The court finds that the original guardianship arrangements were legally valid, properly executed, and fully authorized by the children's parents. Charles Whitmore's decision to entrust his children to Mrs. Montgomery's care was not made in haste or under improper influence, but as part of a carefully considered plan to ensure their safety and well-being. Sarah felt her breath catch as Judge Morrison moved toward her ruling. Furthermore, the evidence shows that Mrs. Montgomery provided exceptional care for all 3 children. They received proper medical attention, quality education, moral guidance, and most importantly, unwavering love. The adults they have become, a respected educator, a decorated veteran, and a distinguished civil rights attorney, speak to the quality of their upbringing. The court also notes that the community support for Mrs. Montgomery has been overwhelming. Witnesses from every sector of Montgomery society have testified to her character, her devotion to her children, and the positive impact of her family on their community. Judge Morrison's expression hardened as she addressed the underlying motivations of the challenge. However, this court has also heard evidence suggesting that the current legal challenge may be motivated by factors having little to do with legitimate inheritance concerns. The connection between the opposing parties and private investigators, with ties to criminal organizations, raises serious questions about the true purpose of this litigation. Therefore, this court rules as follows. The original guardianship of Emma, Michael, and Sarah Whitmore by Grace Montgomery is confirmed as legally valid and properly executed. Mrs. Montgomery's subsequent adoption of all 3 children is likewise confirmed. The transfer of the Whitmore estate to Mrs. Montgomery's care and management is upheld in its entirety. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers, with community members rising to their feet in celebration of the victory that had been 60 years in the making. Grace remained seated, tears streaming down her face, but her expression was one of quiet gratitude rather than triumph. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, raising her voice over the celebration, this court finds the current challenge to be frivolous and without merit. The opposing parties are ordered to pay all court costs and reasonable attorney fees incurred by the defendants. As the gavel fell for the final time, Sarah rushed to embrace Grace, followed quickly by Emma and Michael. The family that had been forged in love and tested by adversity, had survived the ultimate challenge to their legitimacy. 6 months later, the house on Montgomery's most prestigious street hosted a celebration that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of the court battle. Grace's 85th birthday party filled every room with laughter, conversation, and the sounds of a family that had grown to include not just 3 children and their own families, but the entire community that had supported them through their most difficult time. A new family photo, taken in the same library where Grace had first found 3 frightened children, showed 3 generations united by love, rather than divided by the prejudices that had once threatened to tear them apart. Grace sat in the center, her hair now completely white, but her eyes still bright with the wisdom and warmth that had guided 4 lives through every challenge. Emma stood behind her, one hand resting on Grace's shoulder, her own children gathered around the grandmother who had taught them that family was about choice and commitment rather than biology. Michael, still carrying himself with military bearing, had brought fellow veterans who had found healing and hope in Grace's kitchen conversations. Sarah, her legal victories having opened doors for other families facing similar challenges, represented not just her own success, but the triumph of love over law. The worn leather Bible sat in its place of honor on Grace's side table, its margins filled with 3 generations of prayers, hopes, and thanksgiving for the miracle of a family built on faith and sustained by unwavering love. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Grace stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the garden she had tended for 60 years. The same hands that had braided Emma's hair and bandaged Michael's scraped knees and helped Sarah with her homework had created something beautiful from soil that had once seemed barren. The legal victory had been sweet, but the real triumph was quieter and more enduring. 3 children who had been lost had found their way home, and a woman who had sacrificed everything for love had discovered that love truly was stronger than any force that had ever tried to tear her family apart. In the end, that was the only verdict that had ever really mattered, the judgment of hearts that had chosen each other and never wavered in that choice, no matter what challenges the world might bring.